let's begin. Okay, we're being recorded. So I'd like to welcome you all to what is the fourth and final meeting of this year's Technology and Capitalism seminar series. Myself and my organizer, Jaume Sastre, would like to offer a few quick notes of thanks. As ever, we offer our sincere gratitude to the Catalan Society for the History of Science and the newly established Institute for the History of Science of the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona for their ongoing support for the series. In particular, however, we'd also like to thank Ignacio Suey Matalana and Josep Simon for all the work they've done, without which this series would not have been possible. So thank you so much. Well, I'm now really delighted to introduce our speaker this evening, Donald MacKenzie. Donald is a sociologist of science and technology at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm sure his work, ranging from his sociological modeling of strategic ballistic missile systems to his analysis of financial theories of engines of financial markets, needs little in the way of introduction. His most recent book, Trading at the Speed of Light, How Ultra-Fast Algorithms Are Transforming Financial Markets, was published by Princeton University Press in May. And I must say that many of us here in Barcelona have been discussing not only his most recent work, but have also found enormous value in earlier pieces, such as his 1984 article, Marx and the Machine, in the journal Technology and Culture. So I hope he doesn't mind me mentioning that. But needless to say, we're delighted and humbled to have him presenting today. Donald will talk for around 40 to 45 minutes, which should leave around 40 to 45 minutes for discussion, which we warmly invite everybody here to contribute and participate in. So over to you, Donald.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that very generous introduction. And maybe we can just confirm that my slides are visible to you.
I can see them.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, thank you, because this is a fairly visual kind of talk. And once again, thanks for the invitation. It would be lovely to be in Barcelona doing this face to face, but we have to live within the constraints that we face. And it's an excellent opportunity for me, because the older topic of high frequency trading I've been working on for quite a few years now, but the last third of the talk is going to be on online advertising, which is a new topic for me, and I'm particularly looking forward to feedback on that aspect of it. The two people whose pictures I have put up, Charlotte Rommerskirchen and Koray Chaliskan, are my co-investigators in this new work. They don't spend their entirety of their lives looking at their phones, but you'll see why I've used those photos of them towards the end of the talk, which is going to have three parts to it. First of all, the notion that I'm calling material political economy, which indeed I could have illustrated with reference to that old work of mine on Marx and the Machine, and that's indirectly on volume 1 of Marx's Capital. But because the example is simpler, I'm choosing what is probably my single favorite piece of work in the history of technology, Mark Bloch's paper on the triumph of the water mill, to motivate the notion of material political economy. And then I'm going to talk about high frequency trading, and then finally, final third of the talk, online advertising. So material political economy. Let's go back to 1381, the wake of a pandemic. So in this case, it was bubonic plague, and to the Benedictine Abbey of St. Alban. Not very much of the abbey survived the Reformation in England, but from seeing the gatehouse that has survived, you can get some sense that this was a very important monastery. And in June 1381, in the midst of convulsions throughout much of the English countryside, the townspeople of St Albans stormed the abbey, whose abbot was their feudal overlord. And by one of those strokes of fortune that could connect us to the distant past, there's an almost certain eyewitness, Thomas Walsingham, who was the monk in charge of the scriptorium and the chronicler in many ways of 14th century England. Walsingham described how once they were inside the abbey, the crowd did kind of predictable things like opening up the prison and releasing the inmates, but they went to a room close to the cloister called the parlour and smashed the stone floor of the parlour and took fragments of that stone floor away with them. Bloch situates this in a material struggle going on throughout the European Middle Ages between hand milling on the one hand and water mills and windmills on the other. So you see in the picture on the right a moulin banal. I'm going to explain the term banal in a moment. The nature of the conflict was that feudal overlords such as the abbot of St Albans wanted grain milling to be done in water mills or windmills that they could control, and they frequently confiscated or smashed the stones of hand mills. 50 years previously, the parlour had been paved with confiscated hand mill stones in St Albans, and 50 years on, that was still remembered and resented. So material, political, economy. I'm not trying to be philosophical, ontological here. In a sense, I think everything is material. Given some of the later material, I'll emphasize that materiality isn't just the solid state of matter. Microwaves, for example, which I'll be talking about later, to my mind, are material. Material politics is a notion from actor network theory, formulated beautifully by John Law and Anna Marie Moll in an article from 2008. It refers to an ordering of a material world to which alternatives exist, and the issue of which of those alternatives becomes real has a political aspect in at least a broad sense. And that, in essence, is what went on with hand milling and water milling, two orderings of the material world, and a struggle between them that, in at least a loose sense, was a political struggle. Those of you who know sociological theory may perhaps see the ghosts of Bourdieu and of Neil Fligstein in the background here. The economy is a field, Bourdieu points out, and there are struggles in fields, for example, between incumbents and challengers. But in emphasizing material politics, I'm not wanting to downplay the role of more conventional politics, of legislatures, lobbying, and so on, and that will play at least a minor role in what I've got to say. Material, political, economy. The point of the preference of feudal overlords for water milling was, of course, that they could extract from that process, quite literally extract, get sacks of meal from the process, The mill at Braine-le-Château in what's now Belgium was a moulin banal because it was subject to un droit de banalité. Banality here refers to the legal compulsion for those who tilled the lands of the Lord to grind their grain in the moulin banal. And the droit de banalité was also a fee, 1 out of every 22 sacks, though of course in practice meal gets caught in the ring of a water mill, and that's another way in which meal can be extracted from the process. A few years ago, I was touting the notion of mundane political economy, but I now realize that I was choosing the wrong word. I really should refer to banal political economy. The transformation of the word banal in 18th century France is interesting in this respect. It's banal in the sense that it's everyday and routine, often involves small amounts of money being extracted, but small amounts that aggregate to large amounts that can be major contributions to inequality. There is wonderful data from the economist Thomas Philippon on the unit cost of financial intermediation in the United States. Now, there's not time to go into the technicalities of what exactly Philippon means by that and how he's measuring it. But in essence, consider it as the analog of the Braine banalité. And hey, there is historical progress. The US financial system in the 20th century was extracting only roughly half the rent that was being extracted from the water mill at Braine back in the 13th century. But what's most interesting, most striking, of course, about Philippon's data is that through the long century that he examines, there's no real tendency for the efficiency of the financial system to grow. So 1884, clerks writing in pen on ledgers, possibly by gaslight, through to 2012, well into the age of the iPhone, and the efficiency of the system has hardly moved. The unit cost of financial intermediation has not fallen. One can speculate as to the causes, but the exaction of rent is very likely part of it. So that, I hope, sketches what I mean by material political economy. And now into the first of the two empiricals case studies, high frequency trading, automated, ultra fast, small firms. These are not big banks, new firms, staff often young, predominantly male, at least in the roles involving trading, distinctive technological styles and use of distinctive technological equipment. What you can see in the picture there is the bottom of a microwave dish, and I suspect the rendering of the photograph isn't quite good enough, but if it was, you'd be able to see a lake in the background, almost certainly Lake Michigan. High frequency trading relies on what those involved call signals. Those are patterns of data that inform the decisions of HFT algorithms. Now, one could spend an entire book on those signals, and to a large extent, I have spent an entire book on those signals. But just to give you a sample of the kind of signal that's meant, the price of the share index futures traded in a data center in the western suburbs of Chicago typically move a tiny fraction of a second before the prices of the underlying shares move, and those are traded in the data centers in New Jersey. And that makes the geodesics the shortest paths between that data center in Chicago and the data centers in New Jersey salient, and those geodesics clip Lake Michigan and Lake Erie, as you can see in that map. There's a complex history to the coming into being of that pattern, and I'm not going to go into any detail on it. The man whose picture is on screen, Bob Pogue, played an important role. You won't have heard of him, even if you were from Texas. He was a Democrat Texas representative. You wouldn't remember him, but he was chair of the House of Representatives Agricultural Committee, which was a powerful position, and fighting off what he considered to be trespassing on his domain. And that, and the full story is in my book, that allowed the Chicago futures exchanges to have a sudden intervention in the legislative process in Washington, setting up a new regulator, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, reporting, because those exchanges at that point in time traded predominantly agricultural futures, reporting to the Senate Agriculture Committee, where shares were regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission, which reports to the Senate Banking Committee. Now, the vast bulk of futures trading in the US for many, many years has been financial futures trading, but the Agriculture Committee has never been prepared to give up jurisdiction. So that split regulation continues and underpins that signal by which Chicago futures move a fraction before the prices of the underlying shares. High frequency trading has to be very fast, because signals like the one I've just described are completely common knowledge in the industry, and there's very little subtlety to those signals, at least at the basic level. So you're going to win if you're the fastest, and fastest means very, very, very fast. In 2019, one of my interviewees said that the typical best internal response time of an HFT system was 42 nanoseconds, but 42 nanoseconds is now so 2019. The most recent figure I've got is 15 nanoseconds. A nanosecond is a billionth of a second, and light in a vacuum in a nanosecond, you can see my fingers at roughly the right scale. Light travels only this far, only 30 centimeters in a nanosecond. So that's extraordinarily fast. Beg your pardon, my system has just glitched a little bit. The speed races that I'm talking about are not detectable in standard economic data. I can go into exactly what kind of data you need to detect them if you wish. But I'll just take one point out of this slide, which is those speed races are commonplace. Around one race per minute in each of the 100 leading stocks traded on the London Stock Exchange. So, economy. High frequency trading greatly reduces the costs of trading. It reduces those banality traditionally earned by intermediaries in the financial system. But the expensive speed races inherent to the field limit the savings. I don't, generally speaking, explicitly ask my interviewees what they think about this, but one of these specialists actually just volunteered the point that I'm quoting on the screen. Those engineers that spend day and night on this, it's ridiculous. It's quite ridiculous, mind-numbing, and you see how he continues. In London, in 2015, speed races were being won or lost by something of the order of 5 to 10 microseconds, but that's a long time ago in terms of this field. Nowadays, they are probably, I don't have quantitative data on this, but they are probably being won or lost by nanoseconds. And this makes the speed of light not just a theoretical limit, but a crucial practical constraint. Now, in our home broadband, we are delighted usually if we have fiber optic broadband. That seems extraordinarily fast to us. But the glass of which the core of a fiber optic cable is made slows light to something like 2/3 of the speed of light in a vacuum, where if you can send a signal through the atmosphere, for example, by microwaves, and those are microwave dishes on the towers in the photograph, if you can send it through the atmosphere, the refractive index of the atmosphere is very close to 1. So you're very close to the Einsteinian limit. So that's the preferred technology, not slow fiber optic cables. But to repeat, in a nanosecond, light travels only 30 centimeters. So this makes the very precise location of your equipment a major issue. One of the things people in the field obsess about is what they call fiber tail. Microwaves are fine until you're very close to the final step into the machines in the computer data center that are doing the actual trading. So where you want your final microwave dish in your link is to be on the roof of the data center, like those dishes in the photograph are. And it can cost you a lot of time. A microsecond, and a microsecond is a millionth of a second, so it sounds trivial, but a millionth of a second is 1,000 nanoseconds, and that's quite enough to put you at a huge disadvantage in this field. So you want to be on the roof of the data center, but sometimes the exchanges will not let you be on the roof of the data center. They sometimes have tie-ups with particular communications providers, and only they can have access to the data center roofs. So that, I hope, has given you a flavor of the material political economy of high frequency trading. And now for the third and final part of the talk, I'm going to move on to online advertising. Now, much of what I'm about to say, I suspect, is going to be known to you, but pardon me if I say things that are obvious. And the single most obvious but most important thing, in a sense, is when you go online, the ads you are shown are not, in general, predetermined. Much of the time, there is an instantaneous auction going on for the right to show you that ad. Billions of auctions going on. So it's a business of huge scale, but it's different materially from what I refer to as the Einsteinian materiality of high frequency trading. You got to be fast, but you don't have to be super fast. Your system typically has 100 to 200 milliseconds in which to bid. That's between 1/10 and 2/10 of a second. A tiny time interval, of course, by human standards, but a gigantic time interval by the standards of high frequency trading. That's 100 to 200 million nanoseconds, so a veritable eternity. So a different kind of materiality in its time scale. And in a sense, an intimate materiality in at least two senses. I'm focusing in particular on mobile phones because, of course, those are, in a certain sense, intimate devices. We carry them with us wherever we go. They lie beside us as we sleep at night, and so on. And their materiality plays at least two roles in the world of online advertising. There's a material politics of what should be allowed to pass and what not allowed to pass between the user, her device, and the surrounding systems. But also, and this is the main point I'm emphasizing in what remains, our phones themselves often conduct auctions for our attention. This is not just some kind of technological curiosity, because if nothing else, news journalism, especially rigorous investigative journalism, is a hugely important thing for the health of our societies, of our political life. And it costs a lot of money, and advertising provides some of the funding for this. So The Guardian, unusual among high quality newspapers, of having an open access website, no paywall around it. It makes a lot of its money by showing of the order of 1 billion ad impressions. An ad impression is one instance of an ad being shown to a user. More than 1 billion ad impressions every month, and that makes up somewhere between 1/5 and 1/3 of the revenue of The Guardian. And if that revenue didn't exist, then its newsroom would be a much diminished place. There's a banal political economy of online advertising, again, in the sense both of tiny amounts of money in each individual instance. The winning bid in one of those auctions is usually only a fraction of a cent. But also in a sense that should remind us of the Moulin Banal of Braine-le-Château. A quite remarkable study done by the auditors PwC for the Incorporated Society of British Advertisers traced where the money went that big UK advertisers spent. They found that 1/3 of the money was accounted for by explicit fees paid to intermediaries and tech firms and the like. £15 of it simply could not be traced. They could not work out what had happened to it. And only £51 reached the publisher, such as the Guardian. And that's actually a bit worse than 13th century Brabant, than Braine le Château. It's the equivalent of a banality of 1 out of every 3 sacks, with a lot of meal being caught in the mill ring. Now, of course, publishers know this, and they've tried to curb the losses of meal, or in this case, money. And that makes a couple of seconds after you click on, for example, a news story, on a link to a news story on a news website, contested material terrain. Things go on in the background that are invisible to you unless you're using specialist equipment. And here I'm using a Chrome extension called Header Bid Expert to see where the bids are coming from, to show adverts such as that AXA insurance advert that's on screen there. The auctions are triggered by the web page header. So here is a snippet from the header of that particular web page that was on screen a moment ago. Again, it may be that this is a little bit difficult to read on screen, so I'll just say that what is being indexed here is multiple interlocking infrastructures, some of them involving the tracking of users' actions. So if your eyesight is very good, you may see in the top line of the snippet, Facebook tracking pixel true. In other words, the Facebook tracking pixel is in operation here, and the Facebook tracking pixel is one of the main ways by which users' actions are tracked, and not simply when they are using Facebook, when we are in other places in the web as well. But the infrastructure of auctions is also indexed here, particularly the word pre-bid appears multiple times in the snippet. It's the main open source infrastructure of what in the field is called header bidding. And it's called header bidding because the auction is triggered from the web page header. In the main implementation of header bidding, so not in fact in the way that the Guardian does it, in the main implementation of header bidding, your web browser is what collects the bids for the auction. So this is the mechanism by which your phone is turned into an auctioneer for your attention. Up until about 2014, it was done in a centralized kind of way by a system still in operation, because you can see its acronym here on screen in my little extract from what's going on in the background of that news story. DFP, Google's double-clicked for publishers, the world's dominant ad server. And the ad server is the cloud service that makes the decision which ad to show you in those couple of seconds or so between your click and the story, and then the ads appearing on your screen. And there's a very simple material issue here. an issue of timing, an issue of what happens first. In header bidding, a timer is started and DFP, Google's ad server, is not called straight away. Instead, the user's phone, or in the case of The Guardian, a publisher's system, gathers bids from mini exchanges, so to speak, called supply-side platforms, before the ad server is called. And here are 4 of the main supply-side platforms on screen. And one of my interviewees said that his newspaper moved to header bidding because they felt they were losing money to Google, but also to non-disclosed fees from other ad platforms. And the idea of header bidding was to run all of those platforms against each other and so reduce the rent that they were exacting. But the ad server, to use a term from actor network theory, remains an obligatory point of passage. Even in header bidding, the ad server is eventually called. And at least in English language news publishing, everyone uses Google's ad server. They're kind of locked into it. They don't feel able to move. One of my interviewees told me that his parent company actually owned a stake in AppNexus, which was trying to market a rival ad server, but the newspapers for which he was responsible could not make the move to it because it would be too risky and too disruptive. Now, there are, of course, advantages in controlling an obligatory point of passage, as Google has done. But there are also disadvantages. And here a little bit of conventional politics re-enters my story. An antitrust lawsuit against Google, launched by Texas and other states with Republican attorneys general in December of 2020, in the heated atmosphere following Trump's defeat in the presidential election. Previously, this antitrust lawsuit had been a bipartisan effort, with Democrat states as well taking part in it. But in that heated December, the Republicans went off on their own and launched a lawsuit, which in effect accuses Google of being the Abbot of St. Albans and seeking to smash the handmills that the publishers have been using, seeking to squash the alternative ordering of the material world that header bidding represents. There are many redactions in the original version of the lawsuit, which reminded me of 40 years ago when I was researching nuclear weapons systems, where you would come across documents full of black redactions of this kind. I'm not endorsing the accusations made against Google, but making the material political point that the apparent minutiae of material practices, whether you just call the ad server straight away or whether you collect bids before you call the ad server, those can connect to the market power of giant corporations, and even, as in the case of the lawsuit launched by Texas and the other states, to party politics. Two separate worlds, very different in their material political economies. But just to end, I don't have very much to say because this hasn't happened yet, but the two worlds are going to be coming together. Google has invested $1 billion in the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, where those crucial signals are coming from, and is going to be moving its systems into the cloud. There's a similar deal between NASDAQ and Amazon Web Services. The cloud, of course, is a material place. We shouldn't think about it as something immaterial, somehow floating up in heaven above our heads. It's just as material as today's world of HFT, high frequency trading, but configured quite differently. And over the coming decade, it will be fascinating to watch evolving the material political economy of bringing together these two very different slides. Well, that's it. And I'm going to leave you for a moment with my image credits on screen, because many of those images are not my own photographs, but taken from other sources. And so the authors of those images deserve appropriate credit. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Donald. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, I can indeed. I just need to find the, having had that up for a second, I just need to find the control which will allow me to stop sharing, which is temporarily obscured.
No problem. I mean, in the meantime, I'm sure if this was
good, yes, yeah, someone has done it, which is great.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, Donald, thank you again so much for that fascinating three-parter of a talk. So I think there's so many things to discuss there. I'd like to invite our online members to use this obligatory passage point of the Blackboard system to, I mean, if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I'll try and keep order of it that way. If you have a burning question and I miss you, please just turn your microphone on and camera and ask away. So yeah, I'd like to ask if anybody has any initial questions or comments for Donald. Okay. Dharma, thank you.
Okay.
Please.
Thank you very much, Donald, for this fascinating talk. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I'm wondering about two questions. One, I love this article of Mark Bloch, and in fact, I use it as a very inspiring source to think about resistances. And the thing is that not only the hand mill were smashed, also the windmill and water mill were smashed by peasants. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about resistances to these new technologies, and beyond the ones of the from political parties or political institutions in Texas or beyond. And the other thing, maybe more obvious, is that I think that it's inspiring, this connection with Mark Bloch's case, but in a talk about technology and capitalism, it's interesting to connect this case that it's typically from the feudalism period, no, Mark Bloch. In fact, it's trying to make understandable how the feudal period was built through these technologies. And then if you can say something about that. Thank you very much, Donald.
Oh, great questions, and we could use the remaining 45 minutes with me going on at length and about the answers to them, but I will try to avoid the temptation. Yes, it's important to talk about resistances. There are two quite different kinds of resistances to the high frequency trading infrastructure that I've talked about. One is from incumbents in trading, like the big banks. So that, for example, there's lots of high frequency trading of European shares. There is no high frequency trading in effect of European sovereign bonds. So that, for example, the sovereign bonds of Spain could be traded by high frequency trading, but are not being traded by high frequency trading. That's not, I think, because of a result of an explicit government measure. That's simply because the incumbents have managed to keep the high frequency traders out of the market. Then the other kind of resistance is that sometimes is a very mundane and familiar kind of resistance. A great big microwave tower is not a particularly attractive thing to have in your neighborhood. So in places where the population have some say on what gets built in their neighborhood, high frequency traders have typically not been able to build the often giant infrastructure that they wanted. So that, for example, the microwave links between London and Frankfurt, which is the crucial equivalent geodesic in Europe, don't cross the North Sea by the shortest possible route, because that would have required the construction of two giant towers on the coast of Kent, and those were blocked. So the firms are still losing a microsecond by having to cross close to the Pas de Calais, across the Manche, the Pas de Calais, where the distance is shorter, so you don't need such big towers to cross it. So the resistance is there. Resistance is in the case of online advertising, I mean, including, of course, by many users installing ad blocking software. It's dropped off a little bit as a mode of resistance, I think, in recent years, but certainly around 5 years ago, this was very prominent. And of course, there's also political resistance, particularly focused, actually, most effectively in the European Union. The GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, has been very important here. Its influences are still very evident in the field. And then finally, your point about feudalism and capitalism and Mark Bloch's work being about feudalism rather than capitalism. There are, of course, tricky conceptual issues in applying the notion of rent with two capitalist societies. Keen Birch, who I think is part of our discussion tonight, Keen Birch has written in a very interesting way about those conceptual issues. So this is really more, my sense, a gut feel kind of comment on the financial system, rather than something that I could claim to prove econometrically. But I think, to my mind, it's pretty clear that that remarkable phenomenon documented by Philippon, the fact that the cost of financial intermediation has not been going down despite a century of progress in the underlying technologies of information and communications, that fact is almost certainly to do with the but with the capture of rent by incumbents within the financial system. But as I say, that's a gut feel. I wouldn't be able to write down the equations to prove it.
Thank you. Thank you, Donald.
Thank you, Jaume. Thank you, Donald. Up next is another Jaume Sastre.
Thanks for this really interesting talk. The part on online advertising was really interesting. Because I mean, I think that the way cookies and social platforms work by collecting metadata and selling it to advertising companies is more well known. But how the materiality of how these auctions and bids for attention work, well, it's much less, and I think that it's very important, and it was really interesting. But I wanted to make a question about high frequency trading, and I wanted to ask. I mean, with this extreme sensitivity to location, and with this Einsteinian materiality, in what ways is financial capitalism more fragile now with the hegemony of high frequency trading? Both in material terms, I don't know, malfunctions, attacks, or I mean, the possibility of an attack it's very located, or in terms of economic crashes, the possibility. Is it more easy with high frequency trading with this materiality? Is there talk among participants or governments about whether this acceleration and extreme sensitivity to location makes it more fragile or not? Or
yeah, no, it's great questions. I'll deal with the economic fragility first. It's actually surprisingly difficult to tell. You know, if you went into a large bank and you talked to the traders in a large bank, they would say, yes, you know, those high frequency trading firms, they really do make things more fragile, you know, sort of recreate robust markets because of our human intervention in them. That's why it's much better that the sovereign bonds of Spain are being traded by people like us rather than by the computers of high frequency trading. But in fact, if you look for systematic evidence of high frequency trading exacerbating economic fragility, there really isn't much. I mean, there are certainly some rather alarming episodes, but whether those are genuinely any worse than the kind of episodes that happened before high frequency trading, I mean, the most you could probably say about them is, well, they're faster. You get crashes that are reversed within minutes rather than reversed within days or weeks. The material malfunction, yes, you don't even have to speculate about a terrorist attack. Something as mundane as rain creates malfunctions because raindrops absorb microwave energy, so microwave links tend to go down when it starts to rain, for example, between Chicago and New Jersey. In fact, of course, because this rain is a routine thing, people are ready for it. One of the firms where I spoke to people, what would happen would be a hooter. Huge loud hooter would go off in the trading room to tell them that the microwave link to Chicago had gone down, and what they would simply do was to widen their prices, to reduce the prices of their bids to buy and increase the prices of their offers to sell, to take account of the fact that there was suddenly extra uncertainty. And malfunctions of that material kind, including if they were caused by a terrorist attack, would, I think, be responded to in that kind weight, it would temporarily become harder and more expensive to trade financial instruments. So that's the nature of that vulnerability. And I personally just find it intriguing that something, this is 2022. This is high-tech financial capitalism, but things are still knocked out if it starts to rain.
Thanks.
Brilliant. So I invite other members of the audience to contribute any comments or questions you like. So please just, if you there's a little person with a hand like this, you press that, then I know you'd like to speak. Okay. So Jaume, you have another question.
Well, while other people are thinking, I am also interested in asking about your methodology, which is interviews. I mean, not only, but about the use of interviews, because I see that you're dealing with online advertising in the same way. You have the interviews, the anonymous interviews, and so on. And I wanted you to ask about the pleasures and the pitfalls of this method, and also about the narratives and biases. The affordances, what they allow and what they hide or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I mean, again, a terrific question, and of course one that I do worry about. I would hope actually that in online advertising, that once people are back in their offices, which really they aren't yet in that space, but once they are, we will be able to do some observational work in the relevant firms and complement the interviews with that. Yeah, I mean the pitfalls are very evident, that very commonly in your first interview with someone, they give you a sort of bland and possibly inherently just a little bit defensive. See, in the online advertising space, people will often, in effect, say, "No, of course we don't track users. It's other people who do that." So you get those. They know the worries that the general public have about them, and so they react defensively in that mode. I think the two main ways I've tried to circumvent pitfalls of that kind are, first of all, that if someone is willing, I will interview them many times. Twice, certainly, in high frequency trading. I even have two very long suffering informants, each of whom allowed me to do 9 interviews with them. And what I think happens is that as they start to trust me not to abuse the information that they give me, they start telling me more. So that's one of the circumvention mechanisms. The other is that, of course, I'm not actually asking. I mean, there was a bit of attitudinal stuff in one of my slides. The engineer who said how ridiculous all of this shaving of nanoseconds was, but that was not. I wasn't asking him that. He just volunteered that. I don't, generally speaking, ask about attitudes. I ask about material practices, and that's a bit different. I'm using my interviewees to act as informants on material systems, so to speak. Now, of course, that doesn't stop them lying about those material systems, but many of my crucial informants are engineers, and engineers, in my experience of them, have a fairly strong down-to-earth sense of ethics. That's to say, you may very well feel the need to refuse to answer a question about a system, but the majority of engineers would not be happy lying about a system, not be happy, for example, about lying about where exactly their microwave antennae are. Because, of course, if nothing else, I haven't done this to any large extent, if nothing else, I could in many cases, go take a look and see whether there is an antenna at the place that they claim there is an antenna. So, in those are the two main ways that I've tried to circumvent the pitfalls of interviewing.
Great. And up next we have Owen Carter.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is that all right? Okay, thank you, Donald. I really enjoyed your talk. There was one word in particular that was very striking to me, and it was, I think, when you were describing modern ad serving practices, the idea of an invisible contested terrain, because it strikes me that one of the things that is interesting about, if we go back to old milling practices, is they are necessarily visible, not just in the sense that you can't hide the fact that you're taking a sack of grain, but also the visibility is part of the performance and maintenance of the political order itself. It's part, taking the rent is an act of maintenance in itself. Whereas, just thinking recently, there's been an enormous backlash in the last couple of years to another form of high-speed trading activity, the idea of paid-for order flow, right, where retail investors and the like discover that when they place an order, they trade on their own behalf through their broker is selling that information to high-speed funds who have the speed to run out and immediately open a short position or something like that, betting that effectively retail bets are usually wrong. And this is a thing which takes place and is over before the user even sees that their own thing's been accepted. And there's now an increasing backlash against this. And it strikes me that that is sort of necessarily invisible. The people engaged in these activities want to maintain a picture in which is viewed as, it's flash lads fighting against each other. But the minute that it becomes revealed to be much more widespread, that is actively hostile to the continued existence of that order. So I'm wondering just whether you've seen in the last few years anxieties among your interlocutors, whether there's been a similar kind of fallout, or whether you think just in your own judgment there will be a similar kind of fallout to the sort of revelations that we had from, let's say, the Snowden leaks about other invisible activities which are deeply concerned with maintaining order. So that's a very general invitation to just talk more about this.
Great question, yes. Two or three things to say. One is that one of the reasons I emphasized meal getting caught in the mill ring is that by and large, I think, was not a process that was very visible, because the mill ring is, of course, part of the internal mechanism. So you can't see it. In Scotland, we had the term the miller's poke, poke being a bag, where the miller would, with nobody watching, fill his poke, and there would have been men fill his poke with meal. So there was a breakdown of visibility even in that very simple technology. It's of course one of my motivations for studying online advertising is the phenomenon that's sometimes referred to as the one-way mirror. That's to say, the systems know a lot about you, so often in many cases they don't quite know as much about you as the proponents of those systems would claim that they know about you. while you do not see the systems, so therefore the one-way mirror. Curiously, I actually don't think that the system of payment for order flow is that bad a thing. I mean, there are many things in finance that are worse than they look. There's just the occasional thing which is not quite as bad as it looks, and I think payment for order flow is one of those things. I mean, it's, you know, it inherently sounds like a mafia racket, but in systems where this is pretty closely regulated, such as in share trading in the United States, the rake-off is quite small. You know, the rake-off, it's very hard to be raking off more than a cent per share traded, where you don't have to look too far back in the history of US share trading to times where the insiders rake-off was more like 25 cents per share traded. So yes, there are issues to do with payment for order flow, but it isn't. It's one of those things that, because it sounds so bad, gets a lot of attention, and it, to my mind, is, for example, a less important phenomenon than the arms race of high frequency trading.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't want to monopolize.
No, please, 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 Owen.
Well, no, it's an interesting proposition there. I suppose the idea that ultimately, yeah, that the rake-off is small enough and the activity happens so quickly that it makes the swing involved compared to whether you stop to pick your nose before hitting as a retail. Like I can see the argument, and yet we also know that it's the emotional reaction to it. It's because it sounds, as you say, clandestine, because it is a mode which is just simply inaccessible. And yeah, I suppose that's it's perhaps it's the visibility of a mismatch that was always there and played out in different ways. It's maybe not even a technological story, right? This kind of spread activity that used to just be the bread and butter of the brokers, right?
It's possible that it may have changed somewhat in recent months because of the phenomenon of lay traders coordinating their activity via social media sites. Because from the viewpoint of high frequency trading, the great virtue of trading against lay traders is that their actions are tended to be rather random and uncorrelated. So if you buy from a lay trader, you're not facing much of a risk that there's suddenly going to be an avalanche of sell orders that's going to cost you money. It could be that the coordination via sites such as Reddit is making lay traders order flow more informative to high frequency traders than it used to be. So it could be that they are getting information now from order flow that they really didn't get in the past, because on the time scales of high frequency trading, we were dealing with, in effect, statistically independent trades.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you, Owen. Thanks, Donald. So I think Rebecca had a question or her hand up, but they're now offline. So I'll ask a quick question, if I may. Of
course.
Thanks, Donald, so much. And I really enjoyed the comparison you were making between, well, I guess the mills and the the political economies of milling, and what's happened today. And my question really is about what is distinct now, and particularly with regards to monopolies or monopolization. Because I mean, in using the milling example, I think it was brilliant. It brought to mind also the work of not just Mark Bloch, but Carlo Ginzburg and his work on the miller, the microhistory, in which he made the really kind of important point that in the 16th century, I think it was, or 15th, yeah, 16th century miller, in Italy, the role of a miller was not just milling and extracting and having a close relationship, hopefully, with the landlords, but also as the most important information conduit for that town or village. And what you're pointing to in this work is this kind of coming together of, in some ways, at least I understood, a different kind of monopoly, but almost kind of similar. That information flows in. And I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, no, it's a lovely thought. I should. It's been many years, and I wasn't really interested in milling at the point where I came across Ginsberg's work. So I should go back. To it and look at it. Yes, I mean, and there are very strong tendencies towards monopoly, or at the very least oligopoly in both the spheres I'm looking at. The trouble with speed races is actually in a sense it's exacerbated by technological improvement in trading systems that makes those systems more deterministic. So there's less random jitter in timing in a deterministic system, and a speed race in a deterministic system tends always to have the same winner or winners. So you can see this fairly markedly, say, in US share trading, where the Chicago firm, Chicago Securities, is now doing something like a quarter of all US share trading, and a second high frequency trading firm, Virtu, is doing another 20% of all US share trading. So very oligopolistic. Actually, in online advertising, it's worse. I mean, that sounds like a competitive market in the context of online advertising. The huge presence of Google and of Facebook in online advertising. It's the causes of that are multiple, but one of them, of course, is the network effect in online advertising. The more adverts you show to people, the more data you're able to collect on them. So the better the targeting, so the more likely advertisers are wanting to use your systems and so on. So there's a massive tendency to monopoly in the online advertising system. Header bidding was, in a certain sense, a brave effort to reverse the monopolistic tendency of the field, but it succeeded only very partially. I think in both spheres we have to rely on public policy to try to reduce the monopolistic tendencies of the technologically most advanced spheres of today's capitalism. It's no secret, like most academics in Britain, I was appalled by Brexit, and one of the reasons that it upset me very much is that DG competition has been playing a pretty serious role in orienting European Union policy against monopoly. And so I'm very sad for the UK to distance itself from that very important enterprise.
No, that's brilliant. And yeah, any other questions or comments from our online audience? Jama.
Well, at the risk of monopolizing questions.
Oh, no, do monopolies. We're surrounded by them, so carry on.
I mean, the conversation can go on and on. No, I'm gonna make a big, very general question. Beyond data centers, markets, how trading companies work, microwave dishes, what is the effect of all this to the lives of many people, in the sense that what are the social consequences? Or, I mean, this is a very big question that perhaps has no answer. I mean, the question is capitalism changing in some way with this co-construction of technology and uses? I mean, yeah. Big question. Yeah. Sorry.
Yes, it's you know, and I can only answer it in a very loose and schematic kind of way. In terms of finance, I don't in fact see high frequency trading as a giant disjunction in the effect of financial capitalism in people's lives. Because of course, you could trade in a sort of short-termist kind of way prior to high frequency trading. Of course, it was short-termist in a human time scale, not in the machine time scale, and it was rather more expensive than it is now to trade in that short-termist kind of way, let's say 20 years ago. But it's the effects, you know, the emphasis in firms on share prices, on shareholder value, mergers and acquisitions, private equity, so all the kind of apparatuses of financial capitalism that are interwoven with people's lives. Those were there before high frequency trading, and the effect of high frequency trading on them has not, in fact, I think, been very large indeed. So there is a certain sense in which the high frequency trading is a fascinating sphere, but unless you are one of those Reddit traders, day traders, of which there are millions of people in the United States who've been doing that kind of thing. But unless you're one of those, the activity that I'm talking about has been at some distance from your everyday life. Online advertising, of course, is different in that respect. Each of us, I suspect, unless we have installed effective ad blocking software, are probably, I'm not in fact a very heavy computer user, but even I am probably exposed to several dozen advertisements a day, and many people are exposed to hundreds or even thousands, depending on their consumption habits. And what I want to say about it? Well, yes, you know, it probably does promote wasteful, environmentally damaging consumption, because of course the point is to sell you stuff. Now, the whole system is a lot less effective at selling you stuff than its proponents might want us to believe, but you know, it must, I think, be the case. It is having some effects on patterns of consumption and the like. It is, in a certain sense, a major violation of privacy. So I don't myself tremendously like Zuboff's notion of surveillance capitalism, because surveillance, well, that's a very strong word. And I tend to think that it's better kept for situations which can, for example, lead people to jail or to worse than jail, rather than the collection of data on me with the goal of selling me shoes or toothpaste or Netflix subscriptions, or whatever. So I'm, privacy is important, but it's, there are trade-offs in life, and of course, if we value things like The Guardian with its free-to-access website, absent, I hope those of you who read The Guardian, you may not be able to subscribe to it because that's pretty expensive, but you can, for example, become a contributor to The Guardian. But absent sufficient income from that, The Guardian has to show us ads to keep its newsroom running, and that, for one, that's a trade-off that I will accept. So even there, the effects on our everyday lives are more evident than the effects of high-frequency trading on everyday life, but they need sort of parsed with care. Google is a giant monopolist in many senses, in the quite literal sense of its market. I'm not accusing the company of anything, but simply in the market share that it has in crucial markets. But Google Search, Google Books, Google Maps, all those things have brought human benefits as well. Free to access services of that great power, funded by advertising of the kind that I'm describing. So I don't think this is not a straightforward good versus bad issue. There are issues of nuance and difficult trade-offs involved.
Thank you so much. So we have only 5 minutes left. So does anybody have any final questions or comments for Donald? If not, then I will punish everybody by asking a question. Okay. So, well, Donald, maybe another way into that kind of the conversation you were having with Jaume just then is, for me, the where you think the concept of labor or work fits into this material political economy. In particular, I mean, I was struck by the differences, I imagine, between the mobile phone and the really amazing work you're doing on online advertising and the phone, and maybe the high frequency trading, which is that well, that image of the phone really, for me, evoked the sort of Hart and Negri's concept of the dual process of extraction and abstraction happening in time. And whereas, so in the high frequency trading account you gave in your book, the role of work seemed quite clear. You had the engineers. You had this amazing story of the teams who laid the cables at some point where they were told not to lay it with too much slack because of those things. I was just wondering if the online advertising example allows you to make any new or different reflections upon, I mean, who is doing the work there, or where is the work being done in this? In this Does that make sense?
Yes, no, it absolutely does. Yes. And of course, this is not an observation of any originality whatsoever, but in many cases, it is we who are doing the work. We who are generating the content that makes web search a useful activity, or makes social media a lively place to spend some time, and so on. So that's well known about today's information capitalism, that it recruits us as unpaid labor. Yes, no, absolutely. If you look at any large system, there are humans everywhere, and no large system is, in any sense, fully automated. So I don't know how many of Google's employees are engineers, but there will be tens of thousands of engineers developing and tending these giant systems, well paid, not exploited in any ordinary sense of the term exploited, but people who work for Google do have their complaints about their employer, as people who work for any large corporation have complaints about their employer. So it's not, it's well paid, but it's by no means a utopia. I'm not a sociologist of work, so I haven't focused on those things, and I think if I were, I doubt if my first priority would be to research professional engineers working for high-tech corporations. I think I would concentrate more on Amazon warehouses and gig work and so on, where the conditions are very much worse than they are for those engineers.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, it's 1 minute to 8 Barcelona time, and I mean, we really have work, Donald.
Even in Barcelona, it might be approaching dinner time.
That's another 2 hours. That is. Well, so I'm going to take this opportunity to thank Donald again so much for speaking to us and sharing his thoughts and his new work with us. It was really, really fascinating. I'm sure. I mean, one of the big problems I think with this online platform is that it can feel so. What you get the other end is so empty, But I'm sure. Donald's reconnecting.
Yeah.
I don't. So yeah, just to say that it was well, really great to have you. I'm sure that would be a very large round of applause and many drinks for you afterwards if you were here.
Yeah. Well, I really do wish I was there with you in person, but thank you very much once again for the invitation, and thank you very much for the lively discussion that's given me a lot to think about.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye. It was great.